Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. I just had to think to make sure it actually is Thursday, but yes, happy Thursday. Welcome to our session. My name is Marie Ellis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Public Policy Director here at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Before we even get started with any content, I want to call your attention to some of the Zoom webinar tools that will help you engage today. So first, when you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you can click on the chat and the Q&A buttons. The chat tool is where you can send a message to the whole group or just to the panelists, and make sure you select your audience for the chat. So there's a drop-down list in the to field, and you'll want to select all panelists and attendees to comment publicly. We also have the AI captions. So to turn captions on or off, you can click on the CC button. And then if you have a question for our presenter, please ask it using the Q&A tool. So you can also look at other people's questions and give them a thumbs up for the ones that you'd like to hear answered. I think that's a very underused Zoom tool. So just make me happy and use the thumbs up. I would love that. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted on MCN's social media in the next few days. Moving on to some content. I hesitate to use this word because it's very overused lately, but the federal money coming into Minnesota and other states right now through the American Rescue Plan Act actually can be called unprecedented. And so as nonprofits, we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to educate decision makers on where those funds are most needed and to learn how we can access these dollars to strengthen our communities. Here at MCN, we're advocating that the dollars be used to respond to the ongoing impact of the pandemic and bring about a more equitable recovery. We really appreciate the governor's office and Minnesota Management and Budget partnering with us today to provide information so that you as nonprofits can understand the multiple access and decision points related to these dollars. And so today you'll hear information about how nonprofits and members of our communities can access the dollars that have already been allocated, and information to inform our efforts to influence future decisions about how these dollars are used, whether in local government budgets, the dollars that the governor will be allocating, and the roughly $1 billion in flexible federal dollars that will be in play in the 2022 legislative session. The pandemic shone a really stark spotlight on the racial disparities in Minnesota, and this money is an opportunity to make strides towards closing those disparities. And so we are asking decision makers to really intentionally focus on advancing racial equity with these dollars. For example, MCN is advocating that state and local governments use some of these funds to support nonprofits, specifically prioritizing culturally specific nonprofits and nonprofits in greater Minnesota. It will come as no surprise to everyone on this call that Minnesota nonprofits have really stepped up during the pandemic to meet heightened community needs for nonprofit services. In many cases, demand for those services and the costs of operating during a pandemic have outpaced revenues. And so support for nonprofit infrastructure that strengthens community wellness and economic vitality is critical. I will be back at the end of this session to close out, and I'll share a couple links with you at that time where you can support those efforts. And now I am pleased to turn over the floor to Tom Carr, Executive Budget Officer at Minnesota Management and Budget.
Thank you, Marie. So today I'm here to talk about the $8.5 billion that the state is expected to receive through the American Rescue Plan. And that $8.5 billion is an estimate that will come to state agencies and the state treasury, and does not include funds that went directly to either individuals or directly from the federal government to businesses and other organizations. So as Marie mentioned, this is very unprecedented in size and scope, and will affect the state in many ways, individuals, organizations, et cetera. On the next slide, we'll see that we kind of think about these funds in three distinct buckets. On the first hand, we have the local fiscal recovery funds. So these are funds that are flowing directly to counties and cities and towns. And then there's the state fiscal recovery fund. And these two buckets are largely flexible in use. And so we'll get into the details of what exactly we can use those funds for. But in aggregate, about $5 billion in relatively flexible funds. And then there's this third bucket of approximately 3.5 billion of federal program-specific funds. So with these program-specific funds, you can kind of think about it as a federal agency that then sends money to a state agency for a specific purpose, such as vaccines or food assistance or shelter or something. So it's the things for which we can spend it on is very prescribed from the feds, and it's generally administered in a pretty narrow fashion. And so with each of those, it's an estimate of what we expect to spend over the next few years. Whereas with these flexible funds, those are precise amounts that are coming to the state. On the next slide, we'll look at the eligible uses for these funds. So the American Rescue Plan was hundreds of pages long, and in the bill, there were really only a couple of pages addressing these two groups of funding streams. And it really just had 6 bullet points for what states could and couldn't do. So the bill said states could use it to respond to the public health emergency and its negative economic impacts. It could use it for premium pay for essential workers. It could use it for the provision of government services to the extent of tax revenue losses. So if we had expected to receive 20 billion in taxes, but only actually received 18 billion, we could kind of count that $2 billion difference and just use that portion of the funding to pay for existing budgeted items. And lastly, it said we could use it for water and broadband infrastructure. It subsequently said we could not use those funds to just deposit it into a pension fund or to cut taxes and use it to pay for the tax cuts. So it was really trying to address the pandemic, but also it has become clear, especially in the more than 100 pages of guidance that have subsequently been published by the Treasury, that there's a strong focus on serving the hardest hit and addressing inequities and really addressing the recovery aspect of this as opposed to just immediate kind of vaccine and other public health measures. So there's a strong focus on really helping out the communities that need it the most and focusing on a long-term recovery. And some of the differences between the American Rescue Plan flexible funds and the CARES Act flexible funds that had, so the CARES Act passed early on in the pandemic, and those funds were really short-term in nature, so about a year to spend them, and they had to be for things specific to COVID. And that short time frame especially made it such that it was, it's for things that were unbudgeted and really just to address the pandemic. These funds are greater in magnitude, and we can use them for a longer period of time. So we have about 5 years to spend these funds. And so there's less of a rush to get the funds out the door. And so we can really have a more thorough, outreach and engagement. And also just, as we're learning every day throughout, this pandemic, of how to best use those funds and to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for a bright future. So out of the more than 100 pages of guidance from the Treasury, it really falls into these 4 kind of broad buckets of what states and local governments should be using, should be focusing on using these funds. And for these 2 groups of funds, the US Treasury is sending out the funds in 2 checks. So we've received the first half, and about 1 year from now, we'll receive the second half of the payment. And then on the next slide, we'll start looking specifically at the local funds. So with the local funds, we kind of think about those in 3 different groups. There's funds that went directly from the US Treasury to the 87 Minnesota counties, and that's about 1.1 billion worth. The 21 largest cities in the state also got their funds directly from the US Treasury, totaling about 644 million. And then finally, there are 2,613 smaller cities and towns in Minnesota. We have more than any other state in the union. And the state is expected to receive 377 million for those cities and towns. And so those cities and towns then request the funds from the state, and then we are working to disperse those. One thing I'll just point out here is that there's, as I mentioned, more than 2,600 different units of government, and therefore there are more than 2,600 different decision-making processes going on right now in the state of Minnesota. So insofar as organizations are interested in having their voices heard on how to best allocate those funds, it's really going to be up to each unit of government to decide that. And so it's important to be reaching out frequently to different jurisdictions. And then on the next slide, we'll show that we've made some progress in getting out the funds to these smaller cities and towns. So about 70% of that first half has been dispersed, and we are sending out funds as they request over the next couple of months. We have towns with as few as 10 people in them, and to get a DUNS number and some of the other things that they have to do, it takes a little bit of time. And we've been working, doing a lot of outreach to these towns because some of them just work with paper and mail and aren't as savvy with email and things like that. And so over the next couple of months, we hope to have funds sent to all of them. On the next slide, we'll start looking into the state fiscal recovery funds. So the legislature and governor came to a high-level agreement on how to allocate these funds. So first, they used 1.183 billion of the 2.833 billion for revenue replacement. So this is the amount I was saying earlier that if we were expecting 20 billion in taxes but only got 18, we can kind of use 2 billion for general government purposes. And so they identified 1.183 billion to just split in the next 2 budget periods or biennia for revenue replacement to pay for existing budget items. They also set aside 1.15 billion for next year's legislative session. So we'll get to that in a few minutes, but in the meantime, there's this $500 million portion for the governors and to address immediate needs for COVID response. And so this is, to deal with things such as the Delta strain and other immediate needs as they arise. Next slide. So in terms of accessing these funds, as I mentioned with the local units of government, it's up to each jurisdiction. In fact, the Treasury actually precludes us from putting any restrictions on local governments in terms of how they use their funds. So there really, truly are more than 2,600 different decision-making processes occurring as we speak. For the state fiscal recovery funds, for that set-aside amount of 1.15 billion, that will be appropriated next legislative session next year. There's 2 ways to approach that. You could go through the legislative branch and contact your legislator, and whether senator or representative, to share your ideas on what they could appropriate funds for next session. Or you could work through the executive branch, through the governor's office. And we just yesterday launched, a form online that we'll share here in a few minutes for individuals and organizations to make suggestions directly to the governor's office, directly to the Minnesota Management and Budget Office, and it'll be shared with the responsible state, the state agency that would ultimately implement that idea. And so as we're going through the process of establishing and making governor's recommendations next year, individuals and organizations will be able to share their ideas. Next, we're going to start looking at the federal programmatic funds. So this is the approximately or estimated 3.5 billion in funds that flow from a federal agency such as the CDC or the Department of Agriculture to state agencies such as the Department of Health or the Department of Human Services. for very specific things. And so we'll hit on most of them today, but they largely fall into the governor's priorities of supporting working families, ensuring students catch up on learning, and then supporting small business and driving economic recovery. So on the next slide, we'll start looking at supporting working families. You'll see these top three all relate to childcare programs. And so this is funding that flows to the Minnesota Department of Human Services. There's the WIC program. Oh, and so the childcare funds total more than $500 million. There's the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children. We had additional funding for that for $8.2 million, and that flows through the Department of Health. There's the Department of Commerce's LIHEAP program, low-income home energy assistance, to help families with utility payments, and the state's expected to receive about $167 million. The Department of Human Services administers a few other programs, such as pandemic emergency assistance. There are more than $20 million in grants and awards for older adult programs for things such as home delivered meals or family caregiver support, things like that. Child abuse prevention funds also to the Department of Human Services. And then the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency covers those last three programs for about $350 million for homeowner and rental assistance programs. On the next slide, we have a series of links for individuals looking to learn more or access some of those programs. The one I'll point out, which is particularly relevant this week, is renthelpmn.org. Next slide, please. So the state received more than $1.3 billion for education through this bill. So we received funds through the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, which we had received similar funding in the CARES Act. So that's certainly the largest pot of education funds we received. And then similarly, smaller amounts for assistance to non-public schools and library services and tech grants and special education. There are other various programs that target homeless children and youth and pandemic electronic benefit transfer for college kids. And then about $170 million for school COVID testing. Next slide, please. The Department of Education just a week or two ago published their state plan with the U.S. Department of Education, which outlines how they plan to use some of that fund. So of that $1.3 billion in emergency school relief, 90% just goes directly to school districts, and then a portion is held back at the state level to be used to address learning loss and things like that. And so if you're interested in learning more about how they intend to use those funds, you can see that plan published online. To turn to small business and driving economic recovery, on the next slide. The State Small Business Credit Initiative program is a program that was originally started during the Great Recession back in 2010. I think it was passed, and the state is expected to receive about $75 million for that, for making loans to small businesses. And the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development has not yet published guidance, but is expected to soon. Similarly, the state has various transit systems, the largest of which is the Met Council, and our statewide transit systems are expected to receive in aggregate about $350 million. Lastly, the Capital Projects Fund is a program in the American Rescue Plan for which the bill itself didn't have much information, and the U.S. Treasury hasn't published definitive guidance yet. However, the information they have published on their website suggests that this will be largely for broadband type infrastructure programs and for basically helping individuals and families and businesses improve access to internet and connectivity for things like working remotely, but also telehealth and things like that. And the Minnesota legislature appropriated $70 million of that expected $179 million to the Office of Broadband Development to help our efforts to get statewide border-to-border broadband. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Department of Employment and Economic Development hasn't yet published guidance, but is expected to soon on the business assistance. And then the Met Council also has emergency vouchers to help families find and maintain housing. So this helps with everything from a security deposit and an application fee all the way through trying to find and maintain housing options. On the next slide, we'll look at the last set of programmatic funding, public health funds. So these are funds largely flowing to the Minnesota Department of Health. And so it's over $75 million for various vaccine things. There's a specific $25 million health disparities equity cutout, and funding to study the different strains of the disease as we progress through this pandemic. On the next slide, we have a few links to programs for funds that we didn't cover in this. So again, the $8.5 billion that we covered in this presentation is funding that flowed through either the Minnesota Treasury or through Minnesota agencies. There were also funds that went directly from the feds to businesses. For example, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. There were Minnesota restaurants that applied for, and some have received funding through that. There was the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program for theaters and similar entities. And then last, but certainly not least, for a lot of families, the most notable aspect of the American Rescue Plan was the additional economic impact payment, or what people often refer to as a stimulus check. And Minnesotans across the state received more than $6.3 billion in economic impact payments. And then on the last slide, we have a quick advertisement for our new website, mn.gov/ARP. And as of last night, there is now a form, that individuals and organizations can complete to suggest how the governor's office and state agencies should consider making recommendations for the governor and legislature to appropriate next year. So for all of you out there who have ideas, and I'm sure all of you do, make sure to connect with the governor's office and submit ideas on there as well. At this point, I think we'll turn it back over, and I see some of you have already dropped some questions in the chat, so excited to address some of these.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. I'm excited to look at the website and look at the form because I sure have some ideas. I think I said at the beginning that I really like that thumbs up feature in Zoom, and I'm realizing why. It's because it makes my job as question moderator so much easier. So I'm looking at the top two questions, and I think the answer to them both is probably pretty similar. So let's take them both at once. So Nan asks, nonprofits have good ideas of things they would like to see included in the governor's budget proposal for next year. What is the best way for them to get those ideas into the mix? And then Catherine asks, regarding the federal funds, is it too late to advocate for new opportunities for spending?
Those are great questions. I'll kick it off and maybe pass it to the governor's office for anything that they'd like to add, but it is definitely not too late. So this form just went live and will be up for about 6 weeks for individuals to submit their ideas. And again, that part of the process is just for that $1.15 billion that's set aside for next year. There are also, with the child care funds and all of those other different bunches of programmatic funds, there are some state agencies that have the ability to set some parameters on those programs, but those are generally quite prescribed. And the Minnesota legislature, in fact, in some situations kind of like further narrowed the way that states can use, that our state agencies can use some of those funds. So for that 1.15 billion, and then with especially all, the more than 2 billion flowing to counties, cities, and towns, it is certainly not too late to advocate for how you'd like to see some of that be spent. And the first and foremost, there is that form that's now up online. Any idea submitted through there in the next 6 weeks will be seen by the governor's office, by the Minnesota Management and Budget Office, and then we will work with the state agency that would ultimately be responsible for that. So for example, if there was a suggestion for childcare funding, let's say. The governor's office and Minnesota Management and Budget would see that, and then we would work with the Department of Human Services and ensure that they are also aware of that idea and kind of work with them through that process. And then from now through the end of the year, the governor's office and agencies will be deliberating. And then at the start of next year, the governor's office will publish the governor's recommended budget, which will include how he would intend for that fund, for the 1.15 billion in funds to be spent. And then there's the process of the legislature and the governor sharing their ideas and working together to pass something ultimately. Nico or Plua, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I certainly appreciate you highlighting the web forum. I think that's a huge resource. But I mean, also, it's worth getting in contact with those legislators as well, since they play a pretty critical role in this process. So, but that forum, good way to get in contact with the governor's office and the executive branch more broadly.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you both. Next question. Plua, I see you coming on camera. Did you want to answer that one?
Yes, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm the new policy advisor that'll be focusing on the ARP funds, and so happy to connect if you guys had any further questions. But yes, so the public portal feedback is live, and it will also be in other languages too, amongst Mali and Spanish. So more to come, and happy to work with you all very soon too. Thank you.
Good, thank you. I appreciate it. And hearing that that'll be in different languages kind of flows into our next question as well. So Sean asks, how is MCN and the state of Minnesota working with culturally specific and rural organizations to obtain access to these dollars? So I'll maybe take a crack at that first from the MCN side. One of the things we'll be doing is getting the word out as broadly as we can on all the different pieces of funding, because as I think is made clear by the presentation, it's a pot of money that then is going to 2,600 different jurisdictions. I think Tom mentioned just in Minnesota, as well as the legislative process. And so there's a lot. And so, this session is one of those things, but we'll be putting things out on social media and in a lot of our different emails like Grants Alert and things like that. More specifically, MCN has been working with the Council on Foundations and United Way on a proposal that I kind of teased about earlier called the Nonprofit Resiliency and Recovery Fund. So it's a proposal to use $50 million of the federal ARPA funds coming to the state to use that money specifically for nonprofit support and to prioritize culturally specific nonprofits and those in Greater Minnesota. We put together a plan for that, a proposal for this relief fund, and got to work with some wonderful colleagues, some of whom are on this call from CAL, and I think RISE is on the call. That's Coalition of Asian American Leaders and Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment, and others. I don't want to forget anybody else either. But from culturally specific groups who took a look at the proposal and said, no, this actually doesn't prioritize us. Fix it. And so we did. We went back and made some pretty significant changes, and we're able to get that proposal to a place where it really does prioritize culturally specific nonprofits and those in Greater Minnesota. So that's one piece. If people have other ideas on how MCN can support those nonprofits, please hit me up. I'm on vacation next week, but otherwise I'm around, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So question back over to the others to hear about how the state of Minnesota is doing that work.
Yeah, I'll add here. So my position is definitely a new position because it'll be focused on the ARP funds, but it's also will include an outreach. And so I'm happy to discuss further as to if you have any other ideas on how we can do better outreach and really make sure that, the budget that we are going to be putting together does reflect, the whole state of Minnesota. And also, Nico and Tom has been doing these kind of sessions to really kind of hear your questions and concern. But I think that in the next few weeks, I will be reaching out individually to see if there are any more specific questions or concerns in regards to the ARP funds to really, as many organizations and stakeholders.
Tom or Nico want to add anything to that? All right, cool. We'll move on. I'm looking at a question from Amy. She says, they say Hennepin County just had one round of funding available for food security related to COVID. Is this from federal funds we're learning about here? Or have the funds we're learning about here not been distributed, decided yet? So that's a really specific question, but I think it gets to a broader question of how do we know which funds are coming from the federal ARPA dollars, and how do we know which are just, you know, the usual county and state funds? Can we know that?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to, but it very well may have been their remaining CARES Act funds. So counties and larger cities received funds, coronavirus relief funds through the CARES Act. And the deadline by which governments need to spend those funds was extended to December 31st of this year. And so cities, states, and counties are still spending those funds as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was actually some of the CARES Act funding that they're using for that. But I'm unable to confirm. But just commenting that it could be that it was ARP, it could be that it was just out of their existing budget, or it could have been out of a different federal pot of funds.
Very good. I think one of the difficult pieces of this is knowing what is ARP funds and what isn't. And it's just going to be an ongoing struggle. We can make it work. And then I think the last question that we've got right now, so everyone, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A, please. But the last one for now is, what formula is being used for the amount of funding cities and towns will receive?
That's a great question, and one that especially smaller cities and towns are definitely concerned with. The way that I'll just start by saying that the U.S. Treasury set forth all of the guidance on this, and it's a per capita formula, and it works out so that the initial distribution is about $100 per person. And when I say initial distribution, I mean not that, so the Treasury is sending out the money in two different checks, but the total of those will be about $100 per person. However, and there will be certainly some towns and cities that simply don't request the funds, because those smaller units of government have to request directly from the state. And you know, for a town that has 10 people, that would be getting $1,000, you know, to go through the process of getting a DUNS number and getting hooked up with the state accounting system, and to also be subjected to federal reporting requirements. A lot of smaller towns and cities would just decide that it's not worth it. There are pretty stringent reporting requirements with these funds. That's another big difference between the CARES Act funding and the American Rescue Plan. The CARES Act funding really just required states and local units of government to say, you know, we spent this much money on this thing, and we spent this much money on this thing. In the American Rescue Plan, there's a way stronger emphasis on qualitative reporting, in addition to all of the quantitative, you know, here's how much money we spent type reporting. So states and counties and cities also need to identify which of 65 different eligibility categories does this project fall in. And then each category has different reporting requirements, and you know, ones that are specific to helping out addressing specific communities and addressing negative economic impacts and things. The U.S. Treasury is requiring us to report on how we're identifying that we're serving the hardest hit, and what geographical units are we actually serving, and what information do we know about that area, and are we using evidence-based interventions when we're serving those groups. And you know, there's a lot of work that goes into that, and you know, obviously the intentions are good, but for a really small town, it just may be such that they're not interested in being subject to that level of reporting. And so the ultimate amount that cities and towns receive could be higher, in that there could be a second redistribution among the smaller cities and towns. For example, if 10% of funds were left over, so we've already sent out 70% of the funds. If the last 10% is just never requested, we could take that and reallocate it, in which case the cities and towns that are requesting funds could actually get more than $100 a person. But it works out to about $105 per person per city and town.
Interesting. That's more than I would have guessed. So I appreciate that. And brings up a question that I have related to reporting. Is it right that for the dollars coming directly to the state can report that they are using those funds to backfill revenue loss?
We can use a portion of the funds to the extent that we identify that there was a reduction in revenue. The state has not yet published its estimated amount yet. And in fact, the way the Treasury is requiring states to report it is that it's a rolling calculation. So we will report on August 31st to the feds, we identified X dollars of revenue loss last year. And then each year for the next few years, we can still count additional lost revenue. So they're letting us kind of like start with this hypothetical trend of, we expected to receive 20 billion this year, and then 21 billion next year, and 22 billion the year after that. And then when actuals come in, we can book the amount beneath that each year. And so the total amount could keep growing. And thus far, the legislature and governor agreed to use 1.183 billion of the 2.83 billion total for revenue replacement. And so that effectively kind of backfills the budget to pay for things that would have otherwise been budgeted, essentially.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that. We've got another question in the Q&A from Corey, who says, I'm looking for ideas to help our local rural nonprofits engage with their local governments regarding housing and homelessness. Any thoughts on how to best do this? We were thinking about trying to put together talking points. Anything we could point them to specifically on how these funds could be used for housing and homelessness?
It's hard to have a one-size-fits-all answer to that. And I'm by no means an expert in local government budgeting processes, but there will be probably a pretty wide divide in the process between your Hennepin and Ramsey in Washington counties versus like, Koochiching and St. Louis County and some of the smaller ones throughout the state. And so my sense is that might be best handled specific to that county or that city or that town. And that's about the extent I can go there. I'd be interested to hear if Nico or Plua have other thoughts as they perhaps have more experience with engagement in that realm.
I'm afraid I don't have any recommendations for for lobbying these local governments. But yeah, just my understanding is that the process will likely differ depending on which counties and other local bodies of government you approach. So,
and that's also the housing development is also an issue that will vary drastically between some of these counties as well.
Yeah, certainly. Let's see. Catherine asks, will the 21 largest cities that received funds directly also receive funds passing through the state?
No, so the counties in the 21 largest cities are they're getting their funds directly from the US Treasury, and the state is only working with those smaller cities and towns. And then on the back end, all of local units of government, so even a town with 10 people all the way up to Hennepin County, they will do their reporting directly with the federal government, whereas with the CARES Act funding, the state kind of played the intermediary role, helping the cities and towns with the reporting. So the Treasury has a colossal task on their hands as they'll be working with thousands, more than tens of thousands across the state of local units of government reporting on all of their expenditures.
I can't say I'm envious of that job. I think I'll stay where I am. Let's take one more question. And then to Mary's question, I've got some thoughts on a call to action. So I'll end with that. But from Brian, mental health has seen a huge increased need during COVID. What category of funds would be best to appeal to help address this in youth and families?
Good question. And with areas of concern such as that one, there's actually multiple ways. So with the state and local fiscal recovery funds, there's certainly ways that type of expenditure is eligible. And so as an example, the first item the governor approved under that $500 million amount was a summer learning package. And so that included funds to the Department of Education to give to school districts. It included funds to the Office of Higher Education. And finally, it included more than $6 million for school-linked mental health grants. So to really kind of targeted at, the whole package was for summer learning to address learning loss and things. But clearly there's a need on the mental health side of things for that same kind of larger issue. And so 6 million of the governor's 500 million went directly to addressing that issue. And so that is an eligible expenditure within the ARP flexible funds, which also means that the state could do more than that, the 6 million. Cities and counties could also use some of their funds for that. But secondly, there's all of those programmatic funding streams. And in there, the Minnesota Department of Human Services received, I think something like 20 million for a mental health block grant and a substance abuse block grant additionally. And so those are existing block grants that the Department of Human Services administers. And so they received supplemental funding to that existing block grant to address those issues. And so there's help in those kind of programmatic funds that the Department of Human Services administers. And then states, counties, cities, and towns can also use a portion of their flexible funds, as the governor did with 6 million for school-linked mental health grants.
Thank you. And I will just point the three of you, Tom and Nico and Plua, to Trisha's comment in the Q&A about reporting requirements. I know that a lot of those reporting requirements are coming from federal treasury and you don't have control over that. But to the extent that the governor's office or MMB have control over some of the reporting requirements, I think her comment is something that we hear a lot about, reporting requirements being onerous and really taking away from the good work being done. So wanted to highlight that. I will close by first saying thank you so much to all three of you for being here, and particularly for reaching out to us to offer this session. That was really fantastic. To everyone else on the call, I mentioned earlier that I want to provide some links about how you can help boost MCN's efforts to advocate for the nonprofit sector's ability to continue addressing needs and improving those recovery outcomes for our communities. So the first link that my colleague Shannon or Grace will be putting in the chat is a link to a sign-on letter that's urging the state to use $50 million of the ARPA funds for a nonprofit resiliency and recovery fund. I mentioned that earlier in an answer to a question. You'll see that the letter's dated a few months ago, but it's still relevant. And so we're still using that letter and taking new sign-ons, and also using those sign-ons as we update that group with information as well when we got things to update. And then the second link goes to a web page about MCN's advocacy efforts with cities and counties. So you'll see there a letter that we sent to staff in all 87 counties and those 21 largest cities in Minnesota, urging them to use some of their ARPA funds for nonprofit relief as well. So if you can share that letter with the county and city officials wherever your nonprofit is, that would be fantastic, because they will listen to folks locally more than they're interested in St. Paul's opinions. And send them a note about how the pandemic has affected your nonprofit and really establish that relationship with your city and county governments. Let's see, a reminder that the session was recorded, and so a link to that recording will be posted on our social media in the next few days. Keep an eye out for that. I think that's all I've got. So just a thank you again to Tom and Nico and Plua for being here, for offering this session. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone. Thanks.